Celebrations started in the early hours of this morning.
The vote to leave the European Union was many things, but perhaps above all, it was a vote to control immigration. Now, the legacy of Brexit is making it harder to prevent an appalling human tragedy unfolding in the English Channel, as record numbers of people attempt the treacherous crossing in small boats in their search for a better life in the UK.
Well, Boris Johnson personally has never been one of these right-wing Tories who think migrants are toxic invaders who need to be repelled. He's taken a much more liberal view and has even been quite warm about the idea of an amnesty for illegal migration, whereas the likes of Nigel Farage, for example, have taken a much harder line. And of course, back in the 2016 Brexit referendum, both of those elements, so the Johnson campaign and that harder Farage-led campaign, were necessary really to get the vote leave victory. But Johnson is certainly not one of those naturally hardline anti-migrant politicians.
Once the UK voted to leave on June the 23rd, immigration as an issue just collapsed, not overnight, but progressively over time. And in some instances, attitudes towards immigration started to soften. After the referendum, migration from the EU to the UK collapsed. In 2020, as the pandemic struck, you had about 90,000 more people coming from the UK to the EU than the EU to the UK.
Yet, while officially sanctioned routes for economic migrants from the continent have been drying up, a growing humanitarian crisis of displaced people fleeing poverty and conflict zones has arrived on British shores. Since the start of this year, more than 25,000 people have made the crossing over the Channel in flimsy dinghies launched from French beaches and landing or being rescued off the coast of Kent. In November, for the first time, more than 1,000 people came ashore in a single day. Even though temperatures are now close to freezing and winter is on the way, the small boats keep coming. A tragedy seemed inevitable, and on the 24th of November, at least 27 people, including a pregnant woman and multiple children, drowned. Boris Johnson and Emanuel Macron spoke by phone immediately afterwards. The two leaders agreed to step up cooperation to tackle the crisis, but the unity quickly fragmented. Shortly afterwards, Boris Johnson wrote an open letter detailing his proposals for tackling the crisis, including a request for a bilateral agreement that migrants who cross the Channel should be sent back to France.
Je suis surpris des méthodes quand elles ne sont pas sérieuses. On ne communique pas d'un dirigeant l'autre sur ces questions-là par tweet et par lettres qu'on rend publiques. Nous ne sommes pas des lanceurs d'alerte. Allons.
It is becoming a political crisis, I think, and what's really important is you need to see it in the context of worsening relations between the UK and France, particularly since Brexit. There have been arguments over post-Brexit trade relationships, that sausage wars row that blew up in the summer. Also, the disagreement about fishing licences, which made for a terrible time between Johnson and Macron. The relations between Paris and London at the moment are particularly bad. That's a very damaging context in which to be trying to come up with a deal to fix the migrant crisis.
Immigration has started to creep up on the list of voters' concerns in recent months. Immigration is a bigger issue now than it was, say, 2-3 years ago. Of those voters who are concerned about immigration, however, you have about half of them saying they're concerned about immigration because they want more drivers, more workers in this country, and the other half are as concerned about immigration because they want less.
There are many reasons why the UK is an attractive destination for desperate people gathered in Calais. The grim irony is that one such attraction may just be that it is now harder for the UK to send them back again.
When the UK was a member of the European Union, it had the option under the so-called Dublin III rule of transferring migrants back to the country they first entered for processing. So if a migrant came into Italy, then the UK could potentially send a migrant who came in through that route back to Italy to be processed. Now Britain is outside of that bloc. It doesn't have that option anymore. And the UK government's trying to come up with a deal with France to facilitate those returns, but there's no agreement yet.
Well, we're already in discussions with France. So as you well know, we have agreements in terms of working with them to stop people from leaving France. So much more work on technology, surveillance, because it is in France where we are seeing the major problems. So we have bilateral cooperation and work taking place. And then, of course, we're discussing with all countries, not just France, but other countries around the world. And we are signing agreements. And I've given India as an example. And there are other countries where we're absolutely working on bilateral agreements votes to remove their own nationals and people that have come to our country illegally back to their country of origin.
Johnson and Patel have focused on this issue with increasing intensity, but the boats keep coming. British ministers have already pledged £54 million to France to help pay for increased patrols this year, and now want to send officers to conduct joint searches along French beaches.
Police! Stop!
Well, there are well over 100 miles of coastline from which these dinghies set sail from France that could end up in the UK, and it's quite difficult for French authorities to police all of that coastline all of the time, so the UK wants to help out. But the French resistance to that offer from Britain to send British officers over there to help police these beaches seems to stem from the question of sovereignty. They don't want British police on French soil or French sand, because that territory needs to be policed by the French authorities. And obviously, sovereignty was a key driving force behind that Brexit vote too. So you can see, on the one hand, you've got the British side who are promoting their own sovereignty and defending British territory and British sovereignty. And on the other side, you've got the French taking a similar attitude. In the middle, there are tens of thousands of people who are in grave danger.